When the first Panzer tracks rolled across Poland in 1939, the world was stunned by what the Germans called Blitzkrieg, lightning war. To the German high command, modern warfare was the art of speed, surprise, and iron will. They believed that with discipline, spirit, and brilliant leadership, the Wehrmacht could defeat any opponent, regardless of material strength. As for logistics, to the Germans it was not the soul of war, merely a supporting function, a dry technical matter unworthy of pride. That belief came from their World War I experience. When Germany was blockaded and starved of food, fuel, and raw materials, the generals drew the wrong lesson. They had not lost because of shortages, but because of a lack of will. Between the wars, German military academies glorified Kampfgeist, the fighting spirit, as the source of victory. They admired daring operations and lightning offensives where mechanized divisions could advance hundreds of kilometers in days. Logistics, as one German officer put it, only needs to follow. Just don't get in the way of the advance. While the Germans exalted speed and tactics, the Americans were quietly preparing for a different kind of war, one of industry, organization, and supply. Even amid the Great Depression of the 1930s, the U.S. Army began standardizing equipment, unifying truck models, ammunition, and rations. They believed an army needed not just powerful weapons, but the ability to sustain that power anywhere, anytime. To the Americans, war was a massive logistics equation. Every bullet and every gallon of fuel a vital link in the chain of victory. When war erupted in Europe, Germany looked at the United States with both contempt and caution. They knew America had industrial might, but assumed it was too distant, too soft, too comfort-loving to fight. Joseph Goebbels mocked Americans as salesmen in uniform, incapable of hardship. Chief of Staff Franz Halder wrote in his 1941 diary, "The Americans can produce, but they cannot fight." That arrogance shaped German thinking. Many officers saw U.S. soldiers as big, clumsy men who rely on machines. Captured Germans later recalled believing the war in Europe would end before the Americans even arrived. And if they did, they would be mere auxiliaries to the British, materialistic and lacking fighting spirit. When the war reached North Africa in 1942, that illusion seemed confirmed. At Kasserine Pass, Rommel's forces routed inexperienced American troops. "They fight stubbornly," Rommel noted, "but without experience or understanding of maneuver." He admitted their fine equipment, modern tanks, strong artillery, ample food, but added, they will collapse once their supply lines are cut. For the Germans, victory came not from warehouses or factories, but from spirit and daring. What even Rommel could not foresee was how fast the Americans learned. After Kasserine, they overhauled their command structure, improved air-ground coordination, and expanded their motorized logistics. General George C. Marshall, U.S. Army Chief of Staff, understood that Europe could not be won through brief offensives. "If we cannot guarantee supply for a sustained campaign," he declared, "no tactical victory will matter." Meanwhile, the Germans remained convinced that U.S. logistics would collapse under its own weight. When they heard of the coming Allied invasion, many believed destroying a few ports or supply routes would make the Americans starve on the beaches of Normandy. General Alfred Jodl even said in 1943, "The Americans know nothing of total war and they can produce, but they cannot endure." That overconfidence stemmed from early Wehrmacht campaigns. In Poland, France, and the opening of the Eastern Front, German divisions had advanced vast distances using captured fuel, trucks, and horses. But by winter 1941, during the frozen nightmare of Barbarossa, the truth became clear. Without a reliable supply system, Germany could not sustain long-term warfare. Yet the High Command blamed geography and weather, not their logistical blindness. Across the ocean, the United States was unleashing what President Franklin D. Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. Corporations like Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler turned out trucks, jeeps, and tanks at record speed, one truck every minute. The U.S. Navy safeguarded Atlantic convoys, delivering millions of tons of material to Britain. Strategically, this was the logistical war, invisible to the Germans, but decisive in their defeat. As U.S. forces advanced through North Africa, Italy, and finally France, each campaign rested on colossal supply networks, depots, convoys, and artificial harbors. To German eyes, such efforts seemed wasteful and impractical. Surely the Americans would be bogged down by their own bulk. Yet the opposite proved true. That very cumbersomeness allowed them to sustain continuous strength, unlike the flash and fade pattern of blitzkrieg. German officers often sneered that Americans were spoiled with coffee, cigarettes, mail, and hot meals. What they missed was that behind those comforts stood a logistical system of breathtaking precision: ships, trucks, fuel lines, cold storage, run by hundreds of thousands of support troops. It was not luxury, it was strategy. Morale and endurance were weapons too, and the Wehrmacht, in its pride, failed to see that. Their disdain for U.S. logistics was not merely a misjudgment, it exposed the limits of German military thinking. The Wehrmacht were masters of tactics, but blind at strategy. They could win spectacular short campaigns, but not sustain prolonged warfare. The Americans, by contrast, viewed war as a marathon in which organization and resources decided victory more than brilliance or bravery. By the war's final phase, the contrast was stark. Germany starved for fuel, weapons, and food, while the U.S. Army operated a vast supply chain stretching from New York to Normandy and deep into Germany. The Germans began realizing that what they once mocked, American materialism, was in fact an invisible strength that made their enemy inexhaustible. But by then, it was too late. The Wehrmacht did not lose simply to superior firepower, but to a failure to understand the nature of modern war. They believed victory came from spirit and combat skill, while the Americans knew it came from the ability to feed, move, and sustain an entire war machine, from Detroit's factories to Europe's foxholes. Looking back, many German generals admitted their mistake. Rommel's former chief of staff, General Siegfried Westphal, wrote, "We believed Americans could not fight without comfort. We were wrong. It was because they ensured comfort that they could fight endlessly." That short, bitter reflection closed a chapter in history, one where German military pride paid the price for underestimating an enemy who understood that in the 20th century, logistics was power. In the winter of 1943, Britain had turned into a gigantic warehouse. From southern ports like Portsmouth and Southampton to the quiet countryside of Kent, every road, barn, and empty field overflowed with trucks, fuel drums, artillery shells, and rations. Hundreds of thousands of newly arrived American soldiers trained, built camps, and established fuel depots and supply networks on a scale the world had never seen. The British jokingly called it the friendly invasion, because Americans seemed to be everywhere, bringing their accents, chewing gum, and endless convoys. But for the Allied High Command, it all served one purpose: preparing for the greatest amphibious invasion in history, D-Day. From the spring of 1943, after Germany's defeats at Stalingrad and in North Africa, the Allies knew the time to strike Western Europe had come. Yet to move millions of men and mountains of weapons across the English Channel, they needed something no previous campaign had ever achieved: a fully industrialized logistics system, one that functioned like the assembly line of a colossal factory. This would no longer be a war of separate armies, but of producers, engineers, transport planners, accountants, and logisticians. In Washington, General George C. Marshall and Admiral Ernest King oversaw the preparations on a global scale. Every ton of cargo leaving ports like New York or Norfolk was scheduled down to the day and hour to arrive precisely in Britain. Every jeep, gun, and bullet had a serial number, a route, and a handler. The system became known as Operation Bolero, the massive U.S. buildup in Britain to prepare for the invasion. In less than a year, Operation Bolero brought over 1.5 million American troops and 2.5 million tons of supplies to the small island. Convoys steamed day and night from America's east coast, escorted through U-boat-infested waters by the Navy. Each ship carried thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, rations, and dozens of Sherman tanks and GMC trucks. The lifeblood of Europe's liberation. German intelligence could hardly believe it. Reports from the Abwehr concluded that the Americans cannot sustain such transport volume without collapsing from lack of ships and manpower. They were wrong. The U.S. had built over 4,000 Liberty ships, mass-produced cargo vessels assembled in weeks. At the Kaiser shipyards in California, one Liberty ship was launched in less than 5 days. Each carried up to 10,000 tons of cargo, enough to supply an entire division for weeks. Meanwhile, in Britain, Hundreds of engineers and architects secretly worked on a non-combat weapon that would prove decisive, the Mulberry Harbors. Because the Germans controlled every French port, the Allies needed a way to unload cargo directly onto open beaches. The Mulberry Plan was so audacious that many generals initially dismissed it as madness. To tow entire floating harbors made of concrete, steel and old ships from England to France, assembling them in days right on the sea. Each mulberry stretched nearly 10 kilometers, built from massive concrete blocks called phoenix units sunk to form breakwaters. Behind them floated piers, cranes, and pontoon causeways, allowing thousands of vehicles to dock. At full capacity, one Mulberry Harbor could unload 15,000 tons of cargo per day, equivalent to a major commercial port. Young engineers of the Royal Engineers and U.S. Army Corps worked day and night to complete the design. They knew that without Mulberry, D-Day would collapse within days. Real ports like Cherbourg or Le Havre were within German artillery range and could not be seized immediately. Thus, the floating ports became D-Day's miracle, one born not of firepower, but of logistics. Mulberry was only one part of the grand design. To fuel tens of thousands of tanks, trucks, and aircraft, the Allies built another unbelievable project, an undersea pipeline, Pluto, pipelines under the ocean. From the Isle of Wight, 75mm steel pipes were laid beneath the channel, pumping gasoline directly from English depots into France. When the campaign began, Pluto delivered 1 million liters of fuel per day, greatly reducing reliance on vulnerable tanker ships. Across southern England, American soldiers trained relentlessly, landing with Higgins boats, driving convoys at night, building pontoon bridges in hours. Every logistics unit was divided into specialized groups: fuel, rations, ammunition, repair. Some were as large as small cities, complete with kitchens, cold storage, workshops, hospitals, and communication centers. The U.S. supply system operated like a massive engine, each cog precisely assigned its task. Meanwhile, German commanders still believed the invasion would fail. They estimated the Allies could sustain a beachhead for no more than a week before running out of fuel and ammunition. Intelligence from the German 15th Army, guarding the Channel coast, stated, "The enemy depends entirely on ports. If we destroy their transports and temporary docks, they must retreat. No one in the German high command imagined that the Americans could build floating harbors and underwater fuel lines within days." Behind this vast machinery was a new philosophy of warfare, total industrial war. If Germany trusted in its generals' brilliance and soldiers' spirit, America trusted in organization and mass production. Every bullet, every loaf of bread, every gallon of fuel is ammunition for victory, Eisenhower declared in early 1944. American industry became a silent army. In Detroit's factories, women replaced men gone to the front, assembling tanks, planes, and millions of K-ration boxes. Railroads and highways shuttled goods nonstop to East Coast ports. Even agriculture was mobilized. In 1943 alone, the U.S. produced 11 billion military meals. As D-Day approached, the scale of preparation defied imagination. Over 7,000 ships, 20,000 vehicles, and 156,000 troops in the first wave, with millions of liters of fuel, water, and hundreds of thousands of tons of ammunition. Every vehicle and crate was tagged and scheduled to the hour. If a single fuel truck was delayed, an entire tank unit might halt. So everything was orchestrated through precise timetables, coded systems, and the most advanced radio coordination of the era. On the night before June 6, 1944, convoys and landing ships silently moved out to sea. Hundreds of Liberty ships loaded with supplies followed one another in darkness, escorted by destroyers and minesweepers. On deck, thousands of American soldiers ate their last meal before battle: coffee, bread, eggs, and ham, a luxury by wartime standards. But it was deliberate. As long as they had hot coffee, the system was still working. And if the system worked, they believed they would win. When dawn broke over Normandy's beaches and German guns roared, many ships were hit and countless soldiers fell. Yet even amid chaos, the supply chain kept moving. By the second day, engineers were assembling Mulberry A at Omaha. By the fifth, thousands of tons of cargo were being unloaded, trucks rolling inland. Within 2 weeks, the Allies had landed over 1 million troops and 500,000 tons of supplies. A British journalist wrote, "The Americans have not landed an army, they have landed America itself." For the Germans, it was a profound shock. They had believed the enemy's supply lines would collapse within days. But the Mulberry Harbors, endless convoys, and Pluto pipelines shattered that illusion. One German officer later confessed, "We understood blitzkrieg, but they achieved blitzkrieg through logistics." As Cherbourg fell and Patton's columns rolled into France, the Germans finally realized this was not a war of soldiers and tanks alone. It was a war of engineers, workers, and truck drivers, men who never fired a shot, but kept the army alive and advancing. The industrialization of warfare had turned America into a true superpower. From the factories of Detroit to the beaches of Normandy, everything was linked in one seamless chain of production, transport, and supply. And it was that chain, not any miracle weapon, that paved the road to victory. When the American columns stormed across the plains of Normandy in the late summer of 1944, the euphoria of victory quickly gave way to a silent fear. Fuel was running out. General George S. Patton, the famously fiery and audacious commander, wrote in his diary, "If I had 400,000 more gallons of gasoline, I could end the war." But newly liberated France was a wasteland. Railways destroyed, bridges collapsed, and major ports like Le Havre and Cherbourg still far from full operation. Without fuel, the Sherman tanks and artillery tractors of the U.S. Army would grind to a halt in the fields, a giant army suffocating in its own triumph. Amid this crisis, the U.S. Logistics Command, Communications Zone, COMZ, achieved a miracle known as the Red Ball Express, an unprecedented motorized transport network. The name Red Ball, borrowed from American railroad slang, denoted trains of the highest priority, forbidden to stop or be delayed. Now, on the dusty roads of northern France, Red Ball became the lifeline of the entire Allied force pushing toward Germany. In early August 1944, COMZ issued a daring plan: establish a non-stop, 24/7 truck convoy route between the Normandy ports and the forward depots. Within just 36 hours, thousands of GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks, the icons of American logistics, were mobilized. Every truck bore a red circular insignia on the hood and traveled on two dedicated one-way highways reserved solely for the Red Ball Express, stretching over 700 kilometers. One route carried loaded trucks forward. The other returned empty. Any unauthorized vehicle entering these roads faced heavy penalties from military police. At its peak, more than 6,000 trucks operated continuously, hauling an average of 12,000 tons of supplies per day: fuel, ammunition, rations, spare parts, and even mail from home. On some days, the total soared to 20,000 tons, an astonishing figure compared to the German supply system, still dependent on railways and horse-drawn wagons. Remarkably, of the 23,000 Red Ball drivers, about 75% were African-American soldiers, men who, despite enduring racial segregation within their own army, carried one of the war's most critical burdens, keeping the advance alive. The roads were treacherous, muddy, cratered, and often barely wide enough for two vehicles to pass. Drivers ran through the night without headlights, guided only by a strip of luminous tape on the truck ahead. They faced leftover mines, German ambushes, and deadly fatigue-induced crashes. Yet they kept going, day after day, and from the beaches to the German border. Some said the engines of their GMCs never cooled throughout the campaign. Without the Red Ball Express, Patton's army might have stalled in northern France. Thanks to those convoys, his Third Army continued advancing at a record pace, over 30 kilometers per day on average. When American troops crossed the Seine River, the diesel in the Red Ball tankers had just arrived in time. It was a race not only against time, but against the very limits of sustaining industrial warfare on a continent in ruins. Of course, the system was far from perfect. Thousands of trucks wore out their tires, burned out engines, or were abandoned along the roadside. Drivers slept in their cabs, ate cold rations, and sometimes went a week without bathing. By November 1944, as major ports like Antwerp finally came online, the Red Ball Express began to wind down. But in just 82 days of operation, it had delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies, a figure that still amazes modern logistics experts. German commanders could not comprehend how the Americans maintained such momentum. Wehrmacht intelligence reports repeatedly underestimated Allied supply capacity. Some German generals assumed the Americans were gambling, burning fuel faster than they could produce it. But when they saw endless convoys rolling across France, followed by rail lines loaded with fuel, ammunition, and food to the front. They were forced to admit the Americans had industrialized the very act of moving war. The story of the Red Ball Express was more than a logistical feat. It was a symbol of coordination, engineering, and human determination. While the Germans relied on the will of individual soldiers, the Americans placed their faith in the collective system, in the ability to turn chaos into order, and every spinning truck wheel into a cog of a colossal war machine. After the war, historians looked back and called the Red Ball Express the lifeline of liberated Europe. It not only sustained the Allied advance, but also embodied a new philosophy of warfare. Victory achieved not merely by firepower, but by the ceaseless flow of fuel, food, and ammunition. Every gallon of gasoline poured into a Sherman tank, every crate delivered to the front, testified to an organizational genius far beyond the enemy's imagination. When Patton was later asked whom he owed most for his lightning campaign across France, his answer was brief. "I owe it to the truck drivers. They, the anonymous men behind the wheels, most of them black soldiers long forgotten in textbooks, kept an army moving. Without them, the victories at Paris, Nancy, and Metz might never have happened. And they proved that in World War II, a truck's tire and a fuel drum could be as decisive as a cannon or a tank." After the summer of 1944, while the roads of the Red Ball Express were still thick with dust and engine oil, the Allied High Command began to grasp a fundamental truth. Victory in Europe was not merely a matter of tactics or courage, it was a matter of logistics. Without a continuous flow of fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts, even the most brilliant military plans remain nothing more than drawings on paper. And in this domain, the United States revealed a secret weapon more powerful than any gun or tank, the industrialized organizational strength of modern logistics. While the Germans struggled to transport a few barrels of gasoline through the harsh winter, the Americans were pumping fuel beneath the sea. The Pluto, pipelines under the ocean system, a network of pipelines laid under the English Channel, was completed only months after D-Day, allowing fuel to flow directly from Britain to France. Engineers of the Royal Navy and civilian scientists devised a way to use flexible steel pipes coiled around massive drums called conundrums, the giant donkeys, which were then unrolled along the seabed. Once operational, Pluto carried hundreds of thousands of liters of fuel per day, enough to keep tens of thousands of trucks, tanks, and aircraft running without pause. For the Germans, such a concept bordered on the impossible. The Wehrmacht, still almost entirely dependent on rail transport, found its network paralyzed by Allied bombing in the final months of 1944. Railways were destroyed, fuel reserves exhausted, and the German war industry was collapsing. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the Americans had turned sea, land, and air into a three-dimensional logistics network connected with astonishing precision. From factories in Detroit, goods were packed, shipped across the Atlantic, unloaded at artificial Mulberry harbors, and then carried by the Red Ball Express straight to the front, a seamless supply chain so efficient that even post-war economists marveled at it. But logistics was more than numbers. It was the force that sustained human morale. While German soldiers survived on meager rations, dry bread, and ersatz coffee, American troops received hot meals, cigarettes, mail, and even pumpkin pie on Thanksgiving. Dozens of mobile field kitchens were deployed, and supply units worked through the night to ensure men in the trenches could eat something warm. Many German generals could not comprehend why the enemy wasted resources on such luxuries in wartime. Yet these very details nourished the spirit of the U.S. soldier, enabling him to fight longer and harder than any other army. A captured German officer during the Battle of the Ardennes exclaimed, "We fight with courage. You fight with gasoline and fresh bread." The remark sounded disdainful, but it was in truth a bitter admission. When Panzer tanks were abandoned for lack of fuel while American Shermans rumbled forward without rest, the truth became undeniable. Modern war could not be won by willpower alone. By the winter of 1944-1945, the Americans proved it once again during the crossing of the Rhine. In just 10 days, the Allies built 62 pontoon bridges, enough for hundreds of tanks and trucks to cross Europe's largest river. Each bridge was the result of thousands of man-hours by engineers, drivers, mechanics, and supply crews, people who never fired a shot yet contributed directly to victory. At the same time, The floating harbors and Liberty ships continued their relentless rhythm. Between 1944 and 1945, the United States delivered over 46.7 million tons of supplies to Europe, including 11 billion rounds of ammunition, 1.37 million vehicles, 2.4 billion rations, and 2.5 billion letters. Never before in history had a logistics campaign operated on such a scale, sustaining not only an army, but an entire war. The German view of American logistics changed completely. General Heinz Guderian, father of Blitzkrieg, later wrote in his memoirs, "The Americans did not merely bring industry into war, they industrialized the very concept of war." While German commanders like Rommel and Model still sought victory through maneuver and will, the Americans triumphed through systems, through an organization no single genius could ever replace. This was the turning point of modern warfare. Logistics, once dismissed as the rear work of war, had become a strategic weapon. No longer a supporting act, logistics now determined the speed, reach, and endurance of every campaign. When a nation could ship millions of tons of goods across an ocean and distribute them to every frontline unit with factory-like precision, war ceased to be the domain of tactical prodigies. It became a contest of national organization. In the final months of the war in Europe, this truth became starkly clear. Exhausted and out of fuel, the Germans launched a desperate counteroffensive in the Ardennes in the winter of 1944. At first, they surprised and pushed back the Allies. But as their fuel reserves ran dry, the offensive collapsed. Meanwhile, the Americans restructured their entire supply network in just a few days, moving ammunition and fuel to the front despite snow and chaos. Logistical power turned Hitler's last gamble into the dying gasp of the Third Reich. Perhaps the clearest symbol of American logistical might lay not in statistics, but in the mindset that everything can be organized. When a Sherman tank broke down at the front, a replacement part could arrive within 48 hours. When a unit ran short of ammunition, the nearest depot dispatched trucks immediately, no need to wait for orders from headquarters. This flexibility was sustained by tens of thousands of logistics personnel, men without stars on their shoulders, yet they controlled the fate of the war. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, analysts on both sides reached the same conclusion. America had triumphed not through tactics, but through a complete industrial and logistical system. German military historian Walter Gerlitz later wrote, "America's victory did not come from the battlefield, but from its ports, factories, and warehouses. They fought with productive power." Logistics, once the backstage of war, had become the front line of strength. The Americans were not the first to understand this, but they were the first to turn it into a doctrine of victory. That is why, after the war, generals like Eisenhower, Marshall, and Bradley all emphasized, war is a problem of transportation. And from that foundation, the United States entered a new era, one where the principles of wartime logistics evolved into the architecture of the modern global economy, the Marshall Plan, and the supply chains that would reshape the world. When the last gunshots faded over Europe in May 1945, millions of American soldiers began packing their gear to return home. But beneath the dusty, fuel-stained roads, amid the bustling ports and sprawling warehouses, few realized this. The logistical system the United States had built to defeat Nazi Germany did not vanish after the war. It lived on, becoming the foundation of the modern world. During 4 years of war, America had created a vast global network of transport, production, and distribution. It wasn't just about staggering numbers, millions of tons of cargo, thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of trucks, but about a new philosophy of how to run not just war, but society itself. Power lies not in what you possess, but in how you organize and deliver it. After the war, as the U.S. Department of Defense reviewed its grand strategy, a new phrase appeared in official reports: the logistical revolution. They recognized that World War II had not merely been a war of tanks and bombs, but a war of supply chains, of production schedules, of precise coordination among millions of people and billions of objects. It was this system that allowed the United States to sustain an army of nearly 2 million men on 2 hemispheres simultaneously as something unprecedented in human history. From that experience came a vital principle. Logistics must precede strategy. Without supply lines, every military plan is meaningless. The Pentagon reorganized itself around that lesson. Every campaign was now designed not only around combat objectives, but around transport capacity, inventory, manpower, and resupply schedules. Yet the logistical revolution didn't stop with the military. When American soldiers came home, they brought that same mindset, the spirit of organization, standardization, and mass distribution. Veterans who had worked in depots, transport units, and war factories became the managers, engineers, and entrepreneurs of the post-war era. They carried the lessons of the battlefield into civilian life. Engineers who once designed depots and supply routes for the Army went on to pioneer modern commercial logistics. The development of standardized barcodes, shipping containers, and intermodal transport all bore the imprint of wartime experience. When Malcolm McLean, a former wartime truck driver, invented containerization in 1956, he was applying what he had learned about loading Liberty ships and Red Ball Express convoys, quickly, safely, and efficiently. Beyond transportation, the entire global economy began following the American logistical blueprint. The Marshall Plan, the massive program to rebuild Europe, was essentially a peacetime logistics campaign. Hundreds of thousands of tons of grain, steel, machinery, and supplies flowed from the U.S. to Europe along the same routes that once carried weapons. The war's logistical machinery had been repurposed to rebuild the world, and in doing so, it not only saved Europe from famine and collapse, but bound it economically to the United States for generations. Those organizational principles evolved into what we now call supply chain management, the central nervous system of the modern economy. Every link from production and warehousing to transport and retail is calculated with the same precision the U.S. once applied to every gallon of gasoline for its Sherman tanks. The post-war world entered the age of just-in-time, lean production, and global distribution, all rooted in the wartime lesson that whoever controls the flow of goods controls the future. But the legacy of the logistical revolution was not just mechanical or theoretical as it was human. During World War II, millions of Americans, men and women, white and black, learned to operate as part of a vast machine, each person a small but vital gear. The engineers who built the Pluto pipeline, the drivers of the Red Ball Express, the dock workers at the Mulberry Harbors, all understood that victory came not from a single hero, but from precision, discipline, and teamwork. That spirit became the DNA of post-war America, the age of mass production, supermarkets, and automation. Americans realized that if they could organize a global war, they could organize a global peace. And they did, through trade, aid, and the worldwide logistics networks that still shape our economy today. Yet this legacy carried a paradox. The same logistical power that saved America and the free world also made war seem increasingly distant to the public. As supply chains became so efficient and seamless, people forgot the human cost behind them, the nameless workers who kept the wheels of war turning. Many black drivers of the Red Ball Express went unrecognized for decades until historians rediscovered their stories. The logistical revolution, in the end, is not just a tale of machines. It's a story of dignity, of the unseen hands that make the world function. Today, when we look back on World War II, we often remember Normandy, Ardennes, and the great battles. But professional soldiers see something else, the birth of modern warfare, where logistics was no longer the rear, but the front line. What the Americans achieved in 1944-45 didn't just save Europe. It became the blueprint for every military campaign since, from Korea to Iraq. A NATO officer once remarked, "Every operation we plan today is a refined copy of the logistics plan of 1944. It was no exaggeration. Since World War II, the U.S. military has understood that no victory can endure without solid logistics, and no peace can last without the ability to rebuild as efficiently as they once resupplied in war. Look deeper, and America's logistical revolution offers a lesson beyond the battlefield. Every civilization survives by mastering flow, of goods, of energy, of people, of ideas. When those flows stop, whether through war, disaster, or mismanagement, societies fall into chaos. World War II taught humanity that organization is not just a skill, it is power. In the 21st century, as our world depends on intricate global supply chains, when a delayed container in Shanghai can halt an assembly line in Detroit, we live directly within that wartime legacy. Every port, every warehouse, Every logistics algorithm can trace its lineage to the spirit of 1944, to those who once moved millions of tons across stormy oceans and made it run like clockwork. They didn't just win with guns, they won by making the world work. Logistics, once dismissed as the silent craft behind the front lines, it has become the art of power itself. From the roaring trucks of the Red Ball Express to the containers at the Port of Los Angeles, from the Pluto pipeline to today's digital networks, a single thread connects them all. Whoever controls the flow controls history.